What are you doing here?
I'm getting my mail. I live here.
This building's been having a lot of problems lately. I need to see your ID.
I'm in my own building getting my mail. Why would I need to show ID?
Because I'm telling you to, so stop acting tough and show me your ID.
Buddy, trust me, you're missing the wrong person.
The ordinary Tuesday afternoon of February 14th, 2023 should have been a routine moment when James Mitchell, a 41-year-old history teacher at the local high school, stopped at his apartment building's mailbox hallway at 4:42 p.m. to pick up his mail after a long day of classes. James had taught at the same school for 14 years, was known by his students as Professor Mitchell, who made history come alive through engaging narratives, and lived quietly in a 2-bedroom apartment on the 3rd floor of a middle-class residential building where he had lived for 8 years. He was wearing a dark hoodie and comfortable pants, carrying his work briefcase, and simply wanted to grab his bills and catalogs before heading upstairs to his apartment for dinner. But what began as a mundane 5-minute task transformed into a nightmare that nearly destroyed his life when a corrupt police officer planted drugs on him, and the only reason James didn't go to prison was because the building's security camera captured every second of the evidence fabrication from an angle the officer didn't know existed. James Mitchell had built a respectable life through hard work and dedication to education. He had grown up in a tough neighborhood, had seen many of his childhood friends end up in prison or dead due to gang violence and drug trafficking, and had made a conscious choice to break that cycle through education. James had graduated from university with honors, obtained his teaching license, and spent a decade and a half shaping young minds and serving as a role model for students, particularly those from marginalized communities who needed to see that success was possible through legitimate paths. He had no criminal record, not even a traffic ticket, and he had deliberately lived a life that gave no one reason to question him or his character. The officer who would confront James that day was Ryan Kowalski, a 9-year veteran of the police department with a history that included 2 previous internal affairs investigations for allegations of inappropriate conduct, both filed away without formal discipline. Kowalski had developed a reputation among some colleagues for being overly aggressive in drug arrests and for having an oddly high rate of finding small quantities of narcotics on suspects. He stopped. Multiple defense attorneys had raised questions over the years about the consistency of Kowalski's drug finds, noting his arrests frequently involved conveniently small amounts of controlled substances, exactly below thresholds that would change charges from misdemeanors to felonies, but there had never been a formal investigation of his practices. Kowalski had been patrolling the area around James's apartment building as part of his regular route. The building was in a transitional zone of the city where working-class neighborhoods met higher crime areas, and Kowalski frequently focused his attention on black residents of the building, apparently operating under an assumption they were more likely involved in criminal activity. He had stopped multiple black residents over the months, questioning them about their activities, asking for identification, generally creating an atmosphere of harassment that had led some residents to complain to building management about racial profiling by officers patrolling the area. That specific afternoon, Kowalski had entered the building following James, whom he had seen walking from the bus stop toward the entrance. For Kowalski, seeing a black man in a hoodie entering a building apparently triggered his suspicions, and he decided to investigate. The building had a security system requiring key cards for entry, but residents frequently held doors for others appearing to be entering, and James had done exactly that for the person behind him, without realizing it was a police officer who was deliberately following him. This common courtesy would provide Kowalski access to the building and an opportunity to confront James in a semi-private space away from multiple witnesses. The mailbox hallway was on the 1st floor near the main entrance, a small alcove off the main corridor where residents could access their individual mailboxes. There was a security camera mounted in the ceiling, capturing the entire area, part of the building's surveillance system designed to prevent mail theft and provide general security. The camera recorded continuously to digital storage, preserving footage for 90 days before being overwritten. James wasn't thinking about the camera as he unlocked his mailbox and began pulling out envelopes. His mind focused on planning the next day's lessons and wondering what he would make for dinner. Kowalski entered the mailbox area behind James and immediately asked what James was doing there. The question was odd and aggressive, implying James needed to justify his presence in a building where he lived. James, surprised but polite, responded he was, getting his mail from his mailbox. Kowalski asked if James lived in the building. James confirmed yes, apartment 307, and that he had lived there for 8 years. Kowalski asked to see identification. James, whose decades of experience as a black man in America had taught him to remain calm during police encounters, even when he had done nothing wrong, carefully placed his mail on a nearby surface and reached for his wallet to retrieve his driver's license. James provided his driver's license to Kowalski, who examined it, while looking from James to the photo and back repeatedly. Kowalski asked what James did for a living. James responded he was a history teacher at the local high school. Kowalski made a sarcastic comment about how teachers must have a lot of free time to hang around during weekdays. James politely corrected that he had just finished a full day of teaching and was simply getting his mail on his way home, exactly like thousands of other residents did every day. Kowalski's insinuation there was something suspicious about a teacher arriving home after work revealed the bias driving his approach. Kowalski returned the identification, but didn't leave the space. Instead, he began asking questions about whether James had seen any suspicious activity in the building, specifically asking about drug dealing or people coming and going at odd hours. James responded honestly he hadn't noticed anything particularly unusual, that he generally kept to himself and focused on his work and his own life. Kowalski pressed, asking if James was sure he didn't know about any drug activity. James confirmed no and began gathering his mail, preparing to leave the area, clearly uncomfortable with the interrogation. It was then that Kowalski made the move that would change everything. He told James he needed to conduct a quick safety check, given there had been reported drug activity in the building. James asked what this involved. Kowalski said he needed to verify James wasn't carrying any contraband. James, who knew his constitutional rights from the history classes he taught about the Fourth Amendment, politely declined to consent to a search, noting he was in his own residential building getting mail and that there was no reasonable suspicion for a search. Kowalski became visibly irritated by James's refusal. Kowalski then shifted tactics. He said that if James had nothing to hide, he shouldn't mind a quick pat-down. James responded that exercising constitutional rights wasn't an indication of guilt, that citizens had the right to refuse searches without consent or probable cause, and that he was respectfully exercising that right. James's calm and informed articulation of legal principles apparently frustrated Kowalski, who was accustomed to people either consenting to his demands or becoming defensive in ways he could use to justify escalation. Kowalski took a step closer to James, invading his personal space in a way that was clearly designed to intimidate. He said James's refusal to cooperate was making him suspicious, that innocent people generally didn't have a problem with officers conducting safety checks. James, maintaining his composure despite feeling growing anxiety, responded he was cooperating by providing identification and answering questions, but that he wasn't consenting to a physical search of his person. He also noted he had a right to go about his business in his own residential building without being subjected to warrantless searches. What happened next was captured in perfect detail by the ceiling security camera. Kowalski told James to put his hands on the wall while he conducted a safety check anyway for officer safety reasons. James reluctantly complied, recognizing that physically refusing would be used against him, even though verbal refusal was his legal right. As James stood with hands on the wall, Kowalski moved behind him and began making pat-down motions. The camera captured everything from the overhead angle, Kowalski making a big show of checking James's pockets. Then, in a move that would be replayed millions of times, Kowalski's hand going to his own pocket, retrieving a small Ziploc plastic bag containing white powder substance, and then planting that bag in James's back pants pocket. The entire sequence took only 3 seconds, but the camera captured every frame. Kowalski retrieved an object from his own pocket, transferred it to James's pocket, then immediately discovered it in the pat-down. The evidence fabrication was so blatant and clear, there was absolutely no possibility of misinterpretation or mistake. Kowalski then announced loudly he had found suspicious substance in James's pocket. James, genuinely shocked and confused, said he had no idea what substance Kowalski was talking about, that he had never seen it before. Kowalski said in a tone mixing triumph and cruelty that James was under arrest for possession of a controlled substance. James tried to protest, saying whatever Kowalski claimed to have found wasn't his, that he had never possessed drugs in his life, that he was a teacher with a clean career and reputation. Kowalski said everyone said the drugs weren't theirs, that this was what he expected James to say. The camera captured James's body language, the genuine confusion and rising panic of someone being framed for a crime he didn't commit. The camera also captured Kowalski's expression, the confidence of someone who had done this before and expected an officer's word to be believed over a suspect's denials. Kowalski instructed James to turn around and place his hands behind his back. James, now visibly distressed but still trying to remain calm, asked if he could call a lawyer. Kowalski said James would have opportunity to make a phone call once he was processed at the station, but that right now he was being arrested. Kowalski handcuffed James, tightening the cuffs painfully tight on James's wrists. The camera captured James wincing in pain, but not physically resisting, clearly understanding any sudden movement could be used to justify additional force. Another building resident, a middle-aged woman named Sandra Chen, who lived on the second floor and knew James as a quiet and respectful neighbor, walked past the hallway and saw James being handcuffed by Kowalski. She stopped in shock, recognizing James and knowing he was a teacher who frequently brought stacks of papers home to grade. Sandra asked what was happening. Kowalski told her to move along, that this was police business. Sandra hesitated, then asked James if he was okay. James, trying not to worry his neighbor, but clearly distressed, said there was a terrible misunderstanding, that he hadn't done anything wrong. Sandra said she had known James for years, that he was a respectable teacher and wonderful neighbor, and that whatever Kowalski thought he had done must be a mistake. Kowalski told Sandra again to move along, or she could be charged with obstruction. Sandra, though intimidated, said she would be calling building management to report what was happening. She also told James she would make sure his school was notified about the situation so they could provide legal support. Sandra's willingness to stand up for James, even in the face of threats from a police officer, would provide a crucial connection later when investigators began examining the incident. Kowalski began marching James toward the building exit, James handcuffed and carrying none of his belongings, his mail still scattered in the mailbox area where he had placed it, his work briefcase full of student papers left behind. As they passed by the doorman's desk near the main entrance, the doorman on duty, a 50-year-old man, named Miguel Rodriguez, who had worked at the building for 15 years, saw James being led away in handcuffs. Miguel knew James well, had seen him coming and going from the building for 8 years, always polite, always respectful, often stopping to chat about weather or local sports teams. Miguel asked what was happening. Kowalski briefly said James was being arrested for drug possession. Miguel looked incredulous, saying there must be some mistake because James was a teacher who had never caused any problem in 8 years of residence. Kowalski said evidence had been found on James's person, and that was all Miguel needed to know. Miguel asked if he should call someone for James, a lawyer or family member. James, his voice breaking with emotion but still trying to maintain some dignity, asked Miguel to contact his sister and let her know what had happened. He also asked Miguel to ensure his mail and briefcase were placed in his apartment safely. Miguel promised to take care of everything, and immediately after Kowalski had taken James out of the building, he began making calls. He first contacted building management, reporting that a long-term resident had been arrested under circumstances that seemed highly suspicious. He then did something that would prove crucial. He called the building's security department and asked them to preserve all security camera footage from the mailbox area that afternoon. Miguel had no authority to request this officially, but the security supervisor, who also knew James and was disturbed by the arrest report, agreed to flag the footage and ensure it wouldn't be overwritten during the normal 90-day recycling process. Kowalski transported James to the police station, processed him for possession of a controlled substance, and placed him in a detention cell. During the booking process, James repeatedly asserted his innocence, saying the drugs had been planted on him, that he had never possessed illegal substances, that he was a teacher with stable employment and no reason to risk his career through criminal activity. The booking officer documented James's protests, but treated them as standard denials all suspects made. James was allowed one phone call, which he used to contact his sister, Angela Mitchell, a nurse who lived in a neighboring city. Angela was completely shocked hearing her brother had been arrested for drug possession. She knew James better than anyone, had grown up with him, knew about his commitment to living a clean life and being a positive role model for his students. She didn't believe for a second he was involved with drugs. Angela immediately began making calls, contacting a criminal defense attorney a friend had recommended, explaining the situation, and preparing to post James's bail as soon as amounts were set. She also contacted the principal at the school where James taught, informing him about the arrest, and insisting there had been a terrible misunderstanding that would be resolved. The attorney Angela contacted was David Chen, an experienced criminal defender who had practiced for 22 years and had seen his share of questionable cases. When Angela described the situation, including James's consistent protests the drugs had been planted, something about the case immediately activated Chen's instincts. He had seen multiple cases over the years where drug arrests seemed suspiciously convenient, and he had developed a reputation for aggressively investigating when evidence seemed fabricated. Chen agreed to take James's case and immediately began making arrangements for a bail hearing. The following morning, James was brought before a judge for bail hearing. Chen had already filed motions and had briefed James on what to expect. During the hearing, the prosecutor presented the case as simple drug possession. An officer had conducted a routine pat-down and found approximately 2.4 grams of cocaine in James's pocket. Chen argued James was a teacher with stable employment, no criminal record, deep ties to the community, and zero flight risk. He also noted James vehemently denied possession and alleged evidence had been planted, that these were serious allegations requiring full investigation before James was condemned in the court of public opinion. The judge, a veteran magistrate who had presided over countless bail hearings, noted James's clean record and stable employment and set bail at a relatively modest amount. Angela posted bail within hours, and James was released with instructions to appear at future court hearings. But while James was physically free, the arrest had already begun destroying his life. His school had placed him on administrative leave, pending resolution of the charges. Standard policies requiring teachers facing criminal charges be removed from classroom until issues were resolved. His fellow teachers were shocked, some believing there must be a misunderstanding, others questioning whether they really knew him. Chen immediately began investigating the case, starting with interviewing James extensively about every detail of what had happened. James described the entire encounter in chronological order, from entering the building, to getting mail, to confrontation with Kowalski, to forced pat-down, to planted discovery of drugs. Chen took careful notes, particularly focusing on timeline and location of the incident. He asked James if there was any chance security cameras had captured the encounter. James recalled there were cameras throughout the building, including the mailbox area, but expressed uncertainty whether footage would still exist or if building management would release it. Chen immediately contacted building management and formally requested preservation of all security camera footage from February 14th. He also filed a court motion for the footage, arguing it could contain crucial exculpatory evidence for James's defense. Building management, already alerted by Miguel about the importance of the footage, cooperated completely. They provided Chen access to the security system and allowed him to review footage from the mailbox area from the relevant time. What Chen saw as he watched the recording literally left him speechless. The ceiling camera had captured the entire encounter in high definition, from an angle that showed everything perfectly. Chen watched as Kowalski followed James into the building, confronted him in the mailbox area, demanded identification, pressed for a pat-down, and then, in a sequence Chen replayed multiple times to ensure he was seeing correctly, reached into his own pocket, retrieved a bag of drugs, and planted it in James's pocket before immediately discovering it in the pat-down. The evidence of fabrication couldn't be clearer. Chen had seen many surveillance videos in his career, but this was possibly the most blatant example of an officer planting evidence he had ever encountered. Chen immediately made multiple copies of the footage, preserving it in various formats and locations to ensure it couldn't be lost or destroyed. He then contacted the district attorney's office and requested an urgent meeting. Chen explained he had video evidence demonstrating criminal charges against James were based on fabricated evidence planted by a police officer. The assistant prosecutor assigned to the case was initially skeptical, having heard many allegations of planted evidence over the years, but agreed to meet with Chen and review the video. The meeting was scheduled for 2 days later. Chen brought a laptop with a copy of the security footage, along with documentation detailing every relevant second of the video. He played the footage for the assistant prosecutor, specifically pointing out the moment when Kowalski's hand went to his own pocket, retrieved an object, transferred it to James's pocket, and then immediately discovered it. The assistant prosecutor watched the sequence multiple times, his expression changing from professional skepticism to growing horror as he realized what he was seeing. The assistant prosecutor, a veteran attorney named Robert Harrison, who had prosecuted criminal cases for 16 years, immediately recognized the gravity of what the video showed. He told Chen he needed to take this to his supervisor immediately, that this was no longer just about James's case, but about possible police corruption that could have impacted multiple other cases. Harrison thanked Chen for bringing the evidence to his attention and assured him charges against James would be dropped immediately. He also noted the district attorney's office would have to review all other cases where Kowalski had been arresting officer or key witness. Given his credibility, was now completely destroyed. Within 48 hours, all criminal charges against James were officially withdrawn. The district attorney issued a public statement noting new evidence had emerged, demonstrating charges were without merit, that the case was being dismissed with prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled, and that the office was cooperating with an investigation of police misconduct. The statement was carefully worded to avoid explicitly admitting an officer had planted evidence, but the implication was clear to anyone reading between the lines. James was relieved charges were dropped, but the damage to his reputation and career had already been done. Though the school had allowed him to return to work once charges were dismissed, some parents had expressed concerns about having him as their children's teacher. School administration supported James publicly, issuing a statement noting all charges had been completely withdrawn and James had been exonerated, but whispers and looks persisted. Some of his students treated him differently, some with sympathy, but others with lingering suspicion that comes from any association with the criminal justice system, regardless of innocence. The police department launched an immediate internal affairs investigation of Kowalski. The Internal Affairs Unit obtained a copy of the security footage and conducted a comprehensive review of Kowalski's arrest history. What they discovered was even more disturbing than the single incident with James. Over his 9 years on the force, Kowalski had made 143 drug possession arrests, an extraordinarily high number that had previously been interpreted as evidence of him being a proactive officer. But when investigators examined details of those arrests, concerning patterns emerged. In 108 of those 143 arrests, drugs had been found during pat-downs where suspects had initially refused consent, but Kowalski had proceeded anyway, citing officer safety reasons or suspicious behavior. In 72 of those arrests, quantities were suspiciously consistent, generally between 2 and 3 grams, exactly below thresholds that would change charges from misdemeanors to felonies carrying mandatory prison sentences. In 41 arrests, suspects had alleged drugs were planted, but these allegations had been routinely dismissed as standard denials all suspects made. More damningly, when investigators tracked what had happened to drug evidence in Kowalski's cases, they discovered that in 27 cases, substances had tested as something different from what Kowalski had initially claimed he had found. In some cases, what Kowalski had reported as cocaine had tested as methamphetamine. In others, substances tested as completely different compounds. This inconsistency suggested Kowalski was planting whatever he had available, rather than actually discovering specific substances he claimed to find. Investigators also discovered something disturbing about Kowalski's evidence records. Over the years, there were multiple instances where small quantities of drugs had been logged as removed from the evidence room by Kowalski for training purposes, but had never been returned or properly accounted for. Documentation was sparse and signatures were often illegible. Investigators suspected Kowalski had been systematically checking out small amounts of seized drugs from the evidence room and then planting those substances on innocent suspects to fabricate arrests and inflate his statistics. The department expanded the investigation to include prosecutorial review of all 143 of Kowalski's drug cases. Defense attorneys whose clients had been convicted based on Kowalski's testimony began filing motions for new hearings, arguing his credibility as a witness had been completely destroyed by video evidence of him planting drugs on James. The district attorney's office faced the daunting task of potentially having to review or overturn dozens of convictions, some of which had resulted in people serving years in prison based on evidence that now appeared to have been fabricated. criminal investigators from the district attorney's office took over the case, and Kowalski was arrested and charged with multiple felonies, including planting evidence, perjury, official misconduct, tampering with evidence, and conspiracy. Forensic analysis of the department's evidence records revealed Kowalski had made unauthorized checkouts of seized drugs on at least 34 separate occasions over a 5-year period. The quantities were always small enough to possibly go unnoticed, but consistent enough to suggest systematic pattern. Kowalski initially denied all charges, claiming the video had been misinterpreted, that he had legitimately found drugs in James's pocket. But his attorney, after reviewing the security footage, told him bluntly the video was indefensible. The sequence of Kowalski reaching into his own pocket, retrieving an object, planting it in James's pocket, and then immediately discovering it was so clear no jury would ever believe his version of events. Facing overwhelming evidence and the prospect of multiple decades in prison if convicted on all charges, Kowalski eventually agreed to cooperate with the investigation in exchange for a reduced sentence. Under limited immunity, Kowalski provided a detailed statement confessing he had planted drugs on at least 36 people over a 5-year period. He explained he had initially started doing it after a more senior partner had suggested that helping evidence appear on suspects they knew were guilty but couldn't prove was sometimes necessary to get criminals off the streets. Over time, the practice had become more casual and frequent. Kowalski admitted he had taken small amounts of drugs from the evidence room, often after large seizures where small portions wouldn't be missed, and kept those bags in his uniform or patrol vehicle to plant on people he decided to arrest. Kowalski's confession sent shockwaves through the local criminal justice system. The 36 people he identified as having been framed included James, but also 35 other victims who had suffered arrests, criminal charges, and, in some cases, convictions and incarceration based on fabricated evidence. Some of these people had accepted plea deals to avoid risking longer sentences at trial, never knowing the evidence against them had been planted. Some had served months or years in prison. Some had lost jobs, custody of children, housing. The lives Kowalski had destroyed through his misconduct were numerous and profound. The district attorney established a special unit dedicated to reviewing all 36 cases Kowalski had admitted, fabricating, plus all his other 107 drug cases that remained under suspicion. The unit included prosecutors, investigators, and defense attorneys working collaboratively to identify which cases were based on legitimate evidence versus planted evidence. The process was complicated by the fact many cases had only Kowalski's testimony as primary evidence, making it impossible to definitively determine whether drugs were legitimately found or planted in the absence of security. Footage like that which had saved James. The review unit worked for 7 months, examining each of Kowalski's cases, eventually determining 31 of the 36 cases he specifically admitted, fabricating needed to have convictions overturned and charges dismissed. In the 5 remaining cases, there was independent corroborating evidence from witnesses or other sources suggesting that while Kowalski may have planted some drugs, the individuals also might have been legitimately involved in drug-related activity, making the cases legally complicated to resolve. But for 31 individuals, the revelation their arrests and convictions had been based on fabricated evidence meant complete exoneration, but couldn't restore lost time or damage to their lives. James involuntarily became a spokesperson for this group of exonerated victims. As the only one who had captured evidence fabrication on high-definition video, his case was the clearest and most irrefutable example of Kowalski's misconduct. Local, and eventually, national media covered the story extensively, with security footage showing Kowalski planting drugs on James being replayed countless times on news programs. The image of Kowalski reaching into his own pocket and transferring a bag to James's pocket became a symbol of police corruption and the danger of blindly trusting officer testimony without corroborating evidence. James gave multiple interviews where he spoke about the experience of being framed, about the terror of facing criminal charges for a crime he didn't commit, about the relief when security footage exonerated him, but also about the recognition he had been extraordinarily lucky that a camera was present and that building management had preserved the footage. He emphasized 35 other people hadn't had that luck, that some had served significant prison time based on Kowalski's lies. James became an advocate for criminal justice reform, particularly focusing on the need for video surveillance of all police interactions and on establishing stronger safeguards against evidence fabrication. Kowalski was eventually sentenced after accepting a plea deal for multiple charges of official misconduct, planting evidence, and perjury. He received 12 years in state prison, a sentence that reflected the gravity of having systematically abused his authority as a police officer to destroy the lives of dozens of innocent people. During the sentencing hearing, the judge noted Kowalski had betrayed not just his victims, but also his fellow officers who did their jobs honestly, that his actions had undermined public trust in law enforcement, and that he deserved a significant sentence that would send a message such corruption would be punished severely. Multiple victims gave impact statements at Kowalski's sentencing hearing. One man described how he had lost his job as an IT technician after being convicted based on evidence planted by Kowalski, how he had been unable to find comparable employment due to a criminal record he carried for 3 years before being exonerated. One woman described how she had lost custody of her 2 young children after a drug charge fabricated by Kowalski, and though custody had eventually been restored after exoneration, her children had spent 18 months in foster care during a critical time in their lives. A 19-year-old described how a conviction based on Kowalski's fabricated arrest had resulted in him losing a college scholarship, forcing him to drop out of the education that had been his route out of poverty. James also provided an impact statement, noting that while he had been exonerated relatively quickly due to security footage, the experience had fundamentally changed how he viewed the criminal justice system and law enforcement. He described the feeling of absolute helplessness of being handcuffed and arrested for a crime he didn't commit, knowing he was telling the truth, but having no way to prove it without footage he didn't. No existed. He noted that if the camera hadn't been present, Kowalski's word as a police officer would have been believed over his denials, and he likely would have faced an impossible choice between accepting a plea deal or risking trial, where a jury would almost certainly believe a uniformed officer over a black teacher. The police department faced multiple lawsuits from Kowalski's victims, collectively seeking tens of millions of dollars in damages for false imprisonment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and constitutional rights violations. The city eventually paid settlements totaling approximately $18.7 million to 23 of the victims who had suffered the most significant harm. James was offered a settlement of $950,000, which he accepted on condition the city also implement comprehensive policy reforms on evidence handling and oversight of officers with unusually high arrest patterns. The reforms implemented as a result of the Kowalski scandal were extensive and transformative. The department implemented a new system requiring all seized drugs be photographed at arrest location by multiple officers' cameras, that evidence be sealed in tamper-proof bags with multiple signatures on site, and that any removal of drugs from the evidence room for any reason require multi-level supervisor approval with detailed documentation. The department also implemented a policy requiring any officer with a find rate of drugs during pat-downs that exceeded departmental average by more than 2 standard deviations be automatically flagged for internal affairs review. Additionally, the department established an independent review integrity unit composed of community members, defense attorneys, and outside investigators who periodically reviewed random samples of drug cases to identify potential patterns of misconduct. The unit had authority to request body camera footage, evidence records, and case documentation, and reported findings directly to the Police Chief and Civilian Oversight Board. Creation of this oversight structure was designed to detect future corrupt officers before they could victimize dozens of people, as Kowalski had done. The senior partner Kowalski had alleged introduced him to the practice of planting evidence also faced investigation. This officer, a 21-year veteran named Thomas Bradford, denied ever planting evidence or encouraging Kowalski to do so, but investigators reviewed Bradford's cases and found similar patterns to Kowalski's, though less extreme. Bradford eventually accepted early retirement as part of a negotiated agreement, avoiding criminal charges but agreeing never to work in law enforcement again, and to cooperate with reviews of his past cases. Investigation revealed a culture of inadequate supervision and implicit pressure on officers to make arrest numbers that had contributed to creating an environment where planting evidence could be rationalized by some as an acceptable tool. 3 supervisors who had overseen Kowalski at various points in his career faced disciplinary action for failing to adequately investigate previous complaints about his practices or recognize statistical patterns that should have raised red flags. One captain was demoted to lieutenant for having specifically ignored a defense attorney's complaint about inconsistencies in Kowalski's testimony. 2 sergeants received 6-week unpaid suspensions and were required to complete extensive retraining on supervisory responsibilities. The disciplinary action sent a message supervisors would be held accountable for failing to detect or address misconduct by officers under their command. James returned to teaching with a renewed sense of purpose, but also with a deeper understanding of the flaws in the criminal justice system he had taught about abstractly for years. He expanded his history curriculum to include a specific unit on criminal justice reforms, using his own experience as an anonymized case study about how bias, corruption, and inadequate oversight could result in innocent people being convicted. His students responded profoundly to the lessons, particularly those from marginalized communities who had seen family members or friends arrested and had never fully trusted officers' explanations about what had happened. James's ability to speak from personal experience while maintaining academic standards made the lessons especially impactful. Angela, James's sister who had immediately believed in his innocence and mobilized resources to defend him, became an advocate in her own right. As a nurse, she had seen many patients whose health conditions were exacerbated by stress of involvement with the criminal justice system. She began volunteering with an organization that provided support to families of people accused of crimes, helping them navigate the legal system and connecting them with resources. Angela often said the experience of nearly losing her brother to a system built on corrupt officer testimony had shown her how fragile supposed justice protections were against error and misconduct. David Chen, the defense attorney whose instincts about James's case and determination to obtain security footage had been crucial to James's exoneration, gained national recognition as a defender who had exposed one of the most flagrant cases of systematic evidence planting in recent history. He used the platform to advocate for changes in how evidence was handled, arguing Kowalski's case demonstrated the need for much stronger safeguards, including requiring multiple forms of documentation for all seized drugs and implementing automated oversight systems that would flag officers with suspicious statistical patterns. Chen became a frequent consultant for police departments across the country, wanting to review their evidence handling practices. Miguel Rodriguez, the doorman who had had the presence of mind to request preservation of security footage immediately after witnessing James's arrest, became a minor but important figure in the story. In interviews, Miguel explained he had worked in building services for decades and had learned that when something seemed wrong, documentation was crucial. His decision to immediately ask security to flag the footage had saved James from the fate of 35 other victims whose arrests hadn't been captured on video. Miguel's employer recognized his actions, promoting him to building operations supervisor and citing his professionalism and quick judgment under pressure. Sandra Chen, the neighbor who had intervened when she saw James being handcuffed, maintained a friendship with. James occasionally appeared as a guest speaker in his classes when he taught the criminal justice unit. Sandra shared perspective as a civilian witness who had chosen to speak up even when an officer tried to intimidate her into silence. She emphasized to students that witnesses had a moral responsibility to intervene when they saw injustice, that staying silent because confronting authority was uncomfortable made people complicit in systems of oppression. Her presentations were powerfully effective precisely because she was an ordinary person who had made a courageous choice at a critical moment. The security recording from the mailbox hallway became one of the most widely studied pieces of video evidence of police evidence planting, viewed over 80 million times across various platforms. The 3-second sequence of Kowalski reaching into his own pocket, retrieving the bag of drugs, and planting it in James's pocket was analyzed frame by frame on news programs, used in documentaries about police corruption, and incorporated into countless law enforcement training programs as the definitive example of what constituted evidence fabrication. The clarity of the video made it impossible for anyone to argue there was ambiguity or misinterpretation. The misconduct was undeniably obvious. Police academies across the country began using the case as a central study in ethics training, showing future officers both the video of the planting and the devastating consequences that had followed. Instructors emphasized that one officer had destroyed not just 36 innocent lives, but also his own career, his freedom, and the reputation of an entire department through his actions. The case became a cautionary example about how pressure to make arrest numbers, combined with inadequate supervision and a culture that prioritized statistics over integrity, could lead even seemingly respectable officers to cross ethical lines into criminal territory. Law schools incorporated the case into professional ethics and criminal procedure curricula. Professors used the security recording to teach students about the importance of corroborating evidence, the dangers of relying solely on officer testimony without supporting documentation, and how to question evidence that seemed suspiciously convenient. The case was also used to teach about exculpatory discovery and prosecutors' obligation to seek justice rather than just convictions. Given that prosecutors in James's case had quickly withdrawn charges once security footage revealed evidence fabrication, the 35 other individuals exonerated as a result of Kowalski's confession had varied trajectories after their exonerations. Some were able to rebuild their lives, using settlement money to return to school, start businesses, or relocate to areas with better opportunities. Others struggled with trauma of having been framed and incarcerated, developing mental health issues, or difficulty trusting. Institutions, multiple formed a support group that met monthly to share experiences and provide mutual encouragement while navigating challenges of post-exoneration life. James occasionally attended these meetings, recognizing that while his exoneration had come quickly, he shared a bond with these people of having been victimized by the same corrupt officer. The community where the incident had occurred maintained a complicated relationship with law enforcement in the years after the Kowalski scandal. Some residents, particularly those from Black and brown communities who had experienced or witnessed racial profiling, saw revelation of Kowalski's systematic evidence planting as validation of long-standing suspicions about police misconduct. Others, particularly those who had blindly supported law enforcement, struggled to reconcile revelation of such extensive corruption with their beliefs about officers being inherently trustworthy. The department worked for years to rebuild. Community trust through community policing programs, transparency about policies and data, and willingness to acknowledge past failures and commit to doing better. The apartment building, where everything had happened, installed additional signage in the mailbox area, noting the area was monitored by security cameras and that footage was preserved for 90 days. Building management also implemented a policy of automatically preserving any footage involving law enforcement interactions with residents, recognizing such recordings could be crucial for protecting both residents and establishing truth about what occurred. The policies became a model for other residential buildings seeking to balance privacy concerns with need for accountability. Kowalski spent the early years of his sentence in a medium-security prison, where he was placed in protective housing unit due to safety risks faced by former police officers and general prison population. Other inmates who had been convicted based on officer testimony or who came from communities impacted by police misconduct viewed former officers as legitimate targets for violence. Kowalski's isolation in the protective unit meant he spent 23 hours per day in a solitary cell with only 1 hour of recreation, conditions many human rights advocates described as equivalent to solitary confinement and potentially constituting cruel and unusual punishment. Some of Kowalski's exonerated victims expressed satisfaction. He was experiencing a fraction of the suffering he had inflicted on others, that his restricted freedom and isolation gave him small taste of what it was like to be unjustly incarcerated. Others, including James, expressed discomfort with his prison conditions, even while acknowledging the gravity of his crimes. James noted he had fought against injustice in his own case and believed the justice system should treat all prisoners humanely, regardless of their crimes. That sinking to an abuser's level by abusing them in return perpetuated cycles of dehumanization that made misconduct possible in the first place. The broader impact of Kowalski's case extended beyond just his direct victims or the specific department where he had worked. The case became nationally cited in legal arguments about importance of preserving exculpatory evidence, about need for reforms in evidence room management, and about how statistical analysis could identify patterns of misconduct that might otherwise remain hidden. Multiple state legislatures considered or passed legislation requiring stricter standards for evidence handling, greater transparency in arrest data, and increased penalties for officers convicted of planting evidence or perjury. Criminal justice reformers pointed to James's case as a perfect example of why innocence wasn't enough to guarantee justice in the absence of extraordinary luck or significant resources. James had been exonerated only because a security camera had captured the evidence planting from a perfect angle, because building management had preserved the footage, because he had had a skilled attorney who had thought to request that footage, and because he had had family resources to pay for an attorney and bail. Remove any of those factors, and he very likely would have been convicted based on an officer's word against his. How many other people were convicted in similar circumstances where evidence was planted, but no camera was present to capture it? James used the platform that came from his case to advocate for universal installation of officer body cameras, with mandatory recording of all police interactions, policies requiring footage be preserved for extended periods and made available for defense review, and creation of national databases tracking officer misconduct that would follow officers across jurisdictions to prevent problematic officers from simply moving to new departments after being fired. He argued technology existed to create significantly more accountability and that only lack of political will was preventing implementation of such systems. The school where James taught eventually honored him by creating the annual James Mitchell Award for Justice and Integrity, given to a student who demonstrated exceptional commitment to principles of justice, ethics, and standing up for what's right even when difficult. James was deeply moved by the recognition, but insisted the award should focus not on his experience, but on encouraging the next generation to be vigilant against injustice in all its forms. He personally participated on the award selection committee and met with each recipient to discuss their aspirations and how they could work towards systemic change in their future careers. Years after the incident, James occasionally visited the mailbox hallway where everything had happened. He still lived in the same apartment, refusing to be displaced from his home by trauma of what had occurred there. The area looked unchanged, the same row of mailboxes, the same terrazzo floor, the same security camera in the ceiling, silently capturing everything for the record. But for James, the space had been permanently transformed from a convenient mail pickup location to a visceral reminder of how quickly ordinary life could be destroyed by a corrupt officer with a badge and a small bag of white powder drugs. The lasting legacy of the case extended far beyond one officer's imprisonment or 36 victims' exonerations. It forced a national conversation about police corruption, the fragility of supposed justice protections, and the critical importance of independent oversight and documentation of law enforcement interactions. The case demonstrated that an officer's word shouldn't be automatically believed without corroborating evidence, that institutional culture and pressures could lead officers to rationalize deeply unethical behavior, and that only through transparency, oversight, and rigorous accountability could society hope to prevent similar abuses in the future. For James Mitchell, the teacher who had simply wanted to get his mail that February afternoon, the experience remained defining in ways both devastating and empowering. He could never recover the sense of security he had felt before experiencing firsthand how easily life could be destroyed by an officer willing to lie. But he also discovered within himself reserves of resilience and commitment to justice that transformed him from a dedicated teacher into a nationally recognized advocate for reform. And through his willingness to tell his story repeatedly despite the trauma of reliving it, he ensured the lesson of his case, captured in those 3 seconds of security footage of Kowalski planting evidence, would continue teaching future generations about the price of corruption and the value of accountability. The small security camera in the ceiling of the mailbox hallway remained, silently capturing thousands of mundane interactions of residents retrieving their letters and packages. Most of those people would never know that same camera system had once captured evidence that would save an innocent man from prison and expose a corrupt officer who had destroyed dozens of lives. But the recording remained as permanent testament to the power of objective documentation, a reminder that truth could be preserved and justice could prevail when evidence existed to challenge the lies of those abusing authority. And that lesson, painfully learned by James and 35 others, would continue to resonate long after the specific victims and specific corrupt officer faded from public memory.